Greetings for everyone, Your Excellency Mr. Hamad Al-Kuwaiti, dear followers across the digital platforms. I am Rahaf Al-Khazraji, researcher at Trends Research and Advisory, and I'll be with you today. And on behalf of Dr. Muhammad Abdullah Al-Ali, the CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, I would like to welcome you to this key event, which is titled the International Law and Cyber Operations, which seeks highlighting the status of cyber operations in the light of international laws and the implications on international peace and security and its role as well in the future wars. We also are going to review some national experiences and case studies in order to achieve a law framework for handling such operation. The cyber operations, which include cyber war, cyber terrorism, and cyber attacks, significantly impact countries and their people's affairs. Even though there is perception that international humanitarian laws to apply to such operations, there is a lack of global consensus over their legal definitions. There are no international laws governing these operations and specifying the state of responsibilities. We need to identify the role of international law in governing these operations and identifying the responsibilities of governments and nations, and whether they are capable of achieving the potential objectives, particularly in the light of the developments that are accelerating. I would like to welcome Dr. Muhammad Hamad Al-Kuwaiti, the head of cybersecurity in the UAE government, who is going to be the keynote speaker for this event. I would like to welcome Dr. Muhammad Al-Kuwaiti. The floor is yours. In the name of Allah, most merciful, most gracious, I would like to thank you very much for hosting us today, and I would like particularly to thank Dr. Muhammad Al-Ali, the CEO of Trends and Research and Advisory, for his generous invitation to take part in this event. And I would like also to greet the team of this event for choosing such a topic, which is one of the key topics that needs to be addressed in the light of the accelerating developments, in the light of the industrial revolution, the AI, the Internet of Things, and the robotics. We know that the digital technology had an impact in creating lots of results and outcomes in the different industries. And today we have the digital economy, which is based on the digital technology. We have identified a need to secure this economy as a part of the national security scheme for the states. We know that the technology provides enormous capabilities that serve the development of nations, but also there are challenges that, if not addressed, they will jeopardize the security and stability of nations and countries. We know that the global is really connected through the internet right now that covers all the aspects of life. And now we depend mainly on digital technology in all aspects of our life. And that makes it normal to have challenges and cyber challenges or attacks that can be in terms of espionage or attacks for information. When we know the increasing dependence on new technology and digital life will lead definitely to an increase in the threats for the assets or the valuable assets in these sectors for more threats. We have recently seen the increase in the number of cyber operations, which were targeted to energy, to transport, to finance, and all the infrastructure and critical infrastructure of nations. We know that the cyber operations right now are being used in the armed conflicts as a tool of war. And we know that these wars are not taking place in the field, but in the cyber field. We know that there are many uses for the cyber operation, whether for defensive or offensive attacks. we know that this will cause a threat for all peoples and countries and communities if we haven't identified these threats and addressed them properly. Now that the threat of the cyber operation has legal complications and issues in the light of having no consensus in the international world, and in the light of having no international laws that govern and regulate the uses of such technology. Some people might see that these cyber operations, which include the cyber terrorism and cyber attacks, can be covered or addressed by the IHL, but the IHL experts, they say that this will not be applicable unless this is used in the armed conflicts. Even in this case, there are legal complication and legislative complication that can be a hindrance in front of enforcing the international law for the cyber operation during the armed conflicts. Some people will see that the regulation of the cyber operations by the international law can be done, but other teams will think, on the other hand, that this part will not be applicable for this operation, and they believe that the use of the cyber technology is a good thing, but the international humanitarian law, we cannot enforce it or apply it to the cyber operation. In the light of all these developments, more countries are being or trying to increase their capabilities by enhancing their cyber capabilities, cybersecurity capabilities. And the UAE is one of the leading countries in this field, and they established the Cybersecurity Council, which is designated and assigned to take part in and define and develop the policies, legislation, and also the strategies for the cybersecurity, follow up the implementation, and develop an integrated strategy and plan across the nation in order to exchange information related to cybersecurity, sharing such information, and developing the governance for such information. And based on the importance of cooperation and collaboration to address the threats of the cyber operation, and also in the conflict in interpretation of the international law for the definition of the cyber operations and their nature, there is a strong need for the international organization, and on top of them, the UN, to put governing and governance for such operation or such process in order to reach international agreement that define the cyber operation, its nature, and put obligations for the countries that are going to use such technology or such tools to incur the results of or the consequences of using such technology. There are other companies also that are using these technologies and using them in their interest. We would like to thank you for cooperation. Would you like to thank you for participating in this symposium in order to highlight the key points? And we would like to thank you very much, and we wish you the best of luck in this symposium. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad Al-Kuwaiti, for this keynote speech. Dear valued attendees, the symposium is going to discuss four main themes. That's cyber operation threat to international peace and security and future wars, cyber operations and international law reality and challenges, experience of the UAE in regulating cyber operations, that's case studies, and the fourth and the last is toward an international legal system to deal with cyber operations. Each speaker will make a presentation within 10 minutes, and then there will be Q&A at the end of the symposium to answer the question. Now I ask Dr. Fahd Al-Sabhan, head of Sabhan Group and chairman of International Center for the Training Studies in the United Arab Emirates, to deliver his speech. Thank you very much, Rahaf. First of all, I would like to thank Trent's research and advisory for this event and key event, and also for selecting the participant in this event. I would like to talk about the themes that I'm going to handle or address in my speech. You know that the development in the digital world and the artificial intelligence, this created the cyber operations, which led to the cyber attacks after that. This is in the light of international agreement or consensus that there is a difficulty in punishing or even identifying who perform such operation. Even for the international courts, the international law is being limited and handicapped in terms of identifying and defining comprehensively the definitions and the term. And you know that before the wars was manual wars, if you can say this, then it developed into chemical wars, to nuclear war, and now also there is a new weapon, which is the cyber weapon. This cyber weapon led to confusion, which led to jeopardizing the theory of armed deterrence. Now it's a kind of, the war is not demolishing, is not destroying, but it's more like disrupting life. The first theme I would like to focus on is the threat of cyber attacks in the light of COVID-19. You know, the COVID-19, this made this social distance that we have, which also obliged us to redefine the humanitarian work. Now we depended mainly on electronic life, on digital life, in order to keep up with the precautions. And this led to an increase in the cyber operation. If COVID-19 doesn't have a direct impact or direct implication, but using the digital life in our daily life in this way made it so difficult. The cyber operation has impact when we talk about on the international law, international security and peace. This is very wide concept, and we know that this covers the political part, economic part, and social part. And it has very special aspects. When we talk about the wars that threat the international peace and security, we know them in general. But now when we talk about something that comes of nothing, all of a sudden it comes without warning, without a kind of being proactive in order to know that something is going to happen, that what we say, this is a key point that impacts the international peace and security. It is also unidentified because it takes place through the international network and internet networks, and it causes threat to the infrastructure, to even academic life. They don't differentiate between civil life and military life. They try to cause comprehensive destruction and disruption across all these sectors. And this is one of the things that is key for us, because we can't identify the perpetrators for this. It causes confusion. Now, when we say, the experts said that in 2021, there will be, they stated in 2020 that in 2021, there will be new type of cyber operations. So without just indicating more or identifying countries, we see that this first 6 months of the year has witnessed and has proved that that was right. And you know, this happened, and it caused great threat and danger to the international peace and security. It is also characterized by the huge power or huge ability to spread fear and terror. And also, one of the key points for this is that these wars are not equal. So we have like parties of the world, they possess like destructive tools with high technology, because we know that traditional weapons is not now the key factor in the cyber wars. So we're talking about the theory of armed deterrence is not that powerful anymore. So because it used to be like the powers of each country in terms of their weapons, in terms of their armed forces, but right now we're talking about digital capabilities. So every country that has higher levels of technology and can achieve or can reach their enemy, they can achieve their targets effectively. So see that also they target civil life and military life. And one of the key aspects also is the low value of this. You don't have to spend lots of money or cost for buying weapons like traditional weapons, but you can achieve the destruction more than these weapons in less value or less cost compared to these weapons. So as I said, that the danger on security and peace, they target the military sector, and they can affect the military sector and getting it out of the command of the country. So the country will not be controlling their army because of this hacking or because of these cyber operations that transfer the command from the nation itself to the attackers. So this is one of the things that needs more time to talk about, but also when say that it also targets the infrastructure of the nation, of the country. They control the oil stations, they control the energy power plants using this digital weapon. The third theme is terrorism, the cyber terrorism, and the impact of this on the international peace and security. Let's say when we put definition for the cyber terrorism, there is no comprehensive definition for the cyber terrorism. We have the Ministry of Defense in the US, they have definition. NATO, they have their own definition. The federal government of the US, they have different definition. But if we just do some efforts in this regard, we can just say that any cyber attack or electronic attack destructs or disrupts the infrastructure or of a government in order to achieve ideological or religious or political objective. I think this can be like comprehensive value more than the others. This doesn't mean that they are not bad or they're not efficient, but we'll say that all the definitions or all the definitions of the others, they talk about the hacking of information or data, they international panic, and the ideological objectives. So these three criteria are the key for any definition of the cyber terrorism. We know that a country, can commit this, or non-state actors can do this, or even ideological groups, independent ideological groups, can do this, or can use this cyber weapons. We say also that cyber terrorism, you don't need to transfer or transport weapons from one place to another. You don't need to move like tanks or arms or firearms or to do this or that. You can do it remotely. So it's out of the armed theories. It's simply to perform and simple to target the objectives. It also causes or tries to cause the international or the public opinion, to move the public opinion towards like demonstrations or acting or doing rights. These are experiences that we saw from other countries. We see also one of the things in the spirit of the armies. We also know that illegal proceeds of illegal proceeds of money, of crimes, and also the control of systems in banks and transferring money from the banks to other, hacking the systems of the banks. We know this can cause panic. We know also it promotes the human trafficking operation, and also arms trafficking and drugs. we know that all of these things can impact the international security and peace. And we know this impact, as I mentioned, I don't want to repeat what I said when I know that we have tight time frame to talk. We'll move to the fourth theme. What are the capabilities of us to combat the threat? How can we do this? I think in order to combat the cyber attacks, if we say that we have the capability 100% to do this, I don't think that we will be fair. But I would say that we are in the Middle East or the underdeveloped countries. We don't have immunity towards these attacks. Even for the countries like U.S. and advanced countries, they still can be victimized for such operation. We can combat such wars by developing the artificial intelligence capabilities to enhance the cyber security tools to prevent such hacks in order to enhance international peace and security. Also, counter technology, when human being is able to develop themselves and develop their capabilities, not by limiting the use of technology, but by developing counter technology to face and address such harmful attacks. Also, we say the capabilities, the technological capabilities, we need to define the concept and embed the concept of cyber operations and the cyber armies of the space in order to embed this in our curriculum, in our curricula, and also for education. We need to be prepared for this. We know that the countries that are using this or doing this, and the countries that are not capable of reaching the space and establishing themselves in the space, will not keep pace with the developed countries. Now, as I say, we live in a different generation. So right now we use the computer instead of 10 human and 10 manpower in the world. So electronic or digital weapons can be enough instead of buying millions or billions of dollars for traditional arms and weapons. But the final question will be, will man be able to address the challenges and the consequences for his actions that led to this situation? And what will happen, and what will happen if we can't address this threat? So all of these are open questions for you that will determine the scope and the level of harm that might happen to our generation. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Dr. Fahd Al-Sabhani, for your valuable presentation. Now we move to the second speaker, Ms. Sama Al-Shawi. She's a legal advisor from International Committee of the Red Cross, and she's talking about cyber operation, international law, reality, and challenges. Thank you very much, Rahaf. And thank you very much for Trends Research and Advisory for their invitation to be with you today to talk about the international law and the cyber operations. I would like to welcome all the guests and all the viewers of this event. In fact, when we all know that the use of cyber operations or cyber attacks has become reality. And within the minutes I have right now, I'm going to discuss a part of the international law, which is the International Humanitarian Law and their role in the cyber operations or attacks in the light of the armed conflicts. And as Dr. Fahd and Dr. Muhammad addressed the cyber operation and cyber wars and how the international humanitarian law can be implemented for this. As you say, the International Red Cross is concerned with the cyber operations during the armed conflicts because of the human cost of this, or the potential cost on humanitarian work and on the civil life and on services, basic services being provided to the human being during these conflicts. These things are being protected by the international humanitarian law, which is implemented and enforced within the armed forces and aims to protect the vulnerable categories and people who are not participating in the armed conflicts, and also the, in terms of the cyber attacks, we know that the cyber attacks pose challenges, huge challenges in armed conflicts. When we talk about IHL, this is because of the interconnectivity between the systems in the light of the cyberspace. We know that the all civilian users and military users are sharing this cyberspace. And because of this interconnectivity between the military and civil systems, there will be very, it will be very difficult in case of cyber attacks in an armed conflict. You cannot target only civil or military target without disturbing the civil services or the civil networks related or connected to such target that you already do. That's why we need to identify that the attacks must be targeted towards only military targets and preserve the civil infrastructure during the uh, armed conflict. And we know this is very difficult, and it's a challenge for the countries that are at launching cyber attacks. Again, because of this interconnectivity, we know that civil services might be under threat. As our colleagues talked earlier, they said that among these infrastructures, we have the healthcare services, the water and electricity networks, the sewage networks, and also transport networks, which mainly depends heavily on navigation systems through GPS. We know that because of this interconnectivity, we know that all of these aspects may be under in the fires or under fire from such attacks. And we have several examples. If you remember, about 4 years ago, when you know that the virus that attacked the UK like 4 years ago, which caused disruption to a major part of the health and healthcare services. Maybe there was no casualties or no fatalities, but we know that in 2020 there was a cyber attack. Electronic pirates attacked one of the university hospitals in Dusseldorf in Germany, and this attack caused the disruption of the efficiency of the capacity of the hospital to about 50%, and even some of the patients needed to be transferred or transported to another hospital to receive treatment. And during the transport of one of the patients, she passed away. So, and you know, these things, when they happen in the light of civil life, you know, even in war, these healthcare facilities are protected by the international laws. And the attack, as you see here, that resulted in the death of one of the lives that is protected by the international law. We know also that in last May, maybe there was also attack in May for the water networks, as one of the hackers managed to increase the sodium hydroxide to double folds in the treated water. And you know, this is a chemical substance that can cause harm to the health of civilians. We have also, they can imagine if this happened in terms of armed conflict, or in the light of an armed conflict, how the international law can protect in this case. The other challenge, we know, we all agree that the international humanitarian law is enforced and applicable to the cyber operations that are taking place in the light of armed conflicts and connected to armed conflicts. So we know that it can happen during a war, for example, and one of the banks is subject to cyber attacks or cyber operation. So this attack or this operation is subject to the international criminal law or the national criminal law in the country, but not the international humanitarian law. But we know that the other attacks that can attack or that can target international or during the international conflicts target military objectives or targets, this can be applicable also. But what we say, if we are in a state of peace and there is a cyber attack against the infrastructure of a country, can we consider this first attack as an attack that triggers the enforcement of the international humanitarian law or not? So if this can be defined, because in the international law, it defines it as if offensive or defensive against operations against an enemy. So right now we are in front of an attack that targets a system or a civilian system. So in this case, can the international law be applicable to this? This is one of the challenges that we have in the light of the international humanitarian law. And another challenge, as my colleagues discussed, the digital data and how countries are depending heavily on such data, so whether for the fingerprints or the personal data or the human account or bank accounts or the data of clients of companies. All of these are digital data. If these data of this data is being targeted through an armed conflict, this can be a civilian target within the definition of the international law, because we know this is restricted by the international law. Can we consider the digital data as civil assets that can be protected by the international law? This is another challenge. There is another challenge highlighted by Dr. Fahd, which is attribution of the act to an entity or a specific state. So taking the responsibility of such an attack and attributing it to the perpetrator who did this. So it's a break of law. And if we can't attribute this attack to an entity or a specific country, so it will be really difficult to identify responsibility for such an attack. And of course, you will not be able to define the perpetrator. And of course, when we are doing this and there is no punishment for this, it will be much easier for the other perpetrator, and they will feel the impunity, so they can repeat this and others can do the same. The attackers can easily cover their identity or be anonymous in their action. So at this time, it's impossible or it's really difficult to say, okay, this perpetrator or this action was which targeted the country, initiated from a country or another. Because you can initiate it from any place in the world. One of the challenges also the escalation of violence, and we see, because we don't know the intention of the attacker. So the target countries, they can use or they can increase their violence towards another nation or another country that suspects that it initiated this action against it. So in this way, the conflict will be escalating, and the use of power or the threat of use power and the international relations will be also in a bad situation. And this is, of course, the UN Charter prohibits this. Also the malware and the other softwares that are developing rapidly, and it's hard to control. We know the cyber wars and cyber attacks in the light of armed conflicts. We know that some countries really they approved this, and they say they didn't deny that they're using this, and they also are developing their defensive capabilities to stop any attacks that they might be or they might target their infrastructure. We know that the International Committee of the Red Cross believes that the international humanitarian law is applicable for any cyber attacks within an armed conflict as a way of, or as one of the methods of the armed conflicts. But we believe or we see that the problem is not whether the international humanitarian law is applicable or not, but how to enforce it, how to interpret the articles in order to enforce them in, for such cyber attacks. We know that maybe we need more dialogue among the countries, among advisors and experts in order to develop new standards and bases that integrates with what we have in the already in the international law. And in general, we know that the international humanitarian law is applicable to cyber operations. This opinion or this view is stated by the International Court when they were addressing the use of nuclear power and the other powers. They stated that the international humanitarian laws principles are applicable to all kinds of wars, even for the future wars. And we know this happened in 1996, and we know that the cyber operation maybe started in the last 2 decades. And we know that according to this, it will be covered by the IHL. And we know that, again, that IHL for the state members or the member states for the protocols of Geneva Agreement. Today is the 44th anniversary of the first agreement in 1977 that was adopted in 8th of June 1977, Article 36 of this protocol, and they said for the countries when they purchase, procure, or maintain new weapons, they need to undertake studies, research, in order to ensure that these weapons are suitable in terms of the international law and the other criteria. Now, I would like to thank you for your time. I'm sorry if I took more time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Sama, for your...
Here is Mr. David Nordell, Director of Synapse Cyber Strategy in Israel. David Nordell will be discussing the experiences of the state in regulating cyber operations. Thank you for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, first of all, to Trends Research. Thank you, Rafa, for chairing this event. I'm very honored to actually be taking part in my first virtual event in the Gulf. I would like to, first of all, make a couple of observations. I'm going to challenge pretty well everything that Sama has said. In the real world of cyber attacks, cyber war, cyber terrorism, most of the players are not going to be interested in international law, whether humanitarian law, law of armed conflicts, whatever. The players, including state actors, can hide behind anonymity or hide behind proxies, or they simply don't care. I've just experienced 11 days of war, let's call it war, to be honest, with Gaza, where the other side, Hamas, was deliberately breaking every possible international law of armed conflict because it served its own purpose to do so. If we look at the Middle East, and we all live here in the Middle East, now, what happened with Hamas can also happen with Hezbollah. It happened in a different context with Daesh, and it can happen with other groups in the future. And I think that we have to be a little bit more hard-headed and realistic about how law does or doesn't matter. I'm not saying that law doesn't matter, but in fact, if you can't enforce the law, then it's just a dead letter. Now, I'm going to talk about what happens in Israel, which takes the view as a result of national experience, that we have to regard what goes on as happening in spite of law. We have to be realistic about what the threats are, what the risks are, and what to do about it with or without law. And I'm sorry if this is going to offend anyone, but this is our national experience, and this is how we have built things over many years. I've been involved in the subject of internet and information technology basically for 25 years, since I was the first advisor to the Israeli government on internet policy. And to be honest, I'm still playing catch up because everything is moving so fast, but let's move forward. I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to explain a couple of things about my personal view. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a regulator. I don't work for the government, although I have been a consultant at the government. I've also done consulting for the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. I'm a cyber strategy consultant, and what this means is I'm looking at the realistic issues of threats and risks. I'm looking at what we cyber professionals, by the way, defenders and attackers, want to achieve, as well as other public interests such as morale, public health, whatever it happens to be. This is mainly about defensive, but a little bit is also about offensive. In other words, cyber war and how it's carried out. I've got a military background, so I look at the cyber war in terms of what I learned once upon a time and how we are now enhancing it with cyber weapons. And if you look at what's happening in the real world of military development, there's a tremendous amount of cyber taking place within, especially special forces units. I can't talk about this, obviously, but it's a subject that anyone involved in warfare does understand. The Israeli model of cyber regulation is based on what needs to be done. It's not based on what international law says. It's not based on Geneva. It's not based on what the UN would like to happen. It's based on what the country needs. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a model that I think is useful and valid for other countries that face threats. Because let's be honest, those who pose the threats, and it doesn't matter whether they're terrorist organizations or nation states, usually don't really care about what the law says. So this Israeli model is based on three different types of regulation. Defense and national security organizations, in other words, Israel Defense Force, the intelligence services, secret service, the security service, the police, all have internal cybersecurity organizations. They have their own regulatory controls. This obviously covers offensive cyber operations, which are mainly carried out by the army and Mossad. I can't talk about what kind of cyber operations, what kind of capabilities, but these are done within very tight controls. It's not as if someone just decides to go off and attack whoever he wants. It's done very deliberately. It's done with care, including trying to prevent damage to, let's call it, the innocent civilians, because we don't want to start wars unnecessarily. We don't want to start wars at all, actually. The next point is purely defensive. Binding regulation, this is something that has been developed over the last 20 years or so, has to do with the critical infrastructures, energy, water, etc., etc. Internet is a critical infrastructure. The defense industries are a critical infrastructure, and these are imposed by the National Cyber Directorate, which is a relatively new organization, and the Bank of Israel acting essentially as an agent for the Cyber Directorate because it is the regulator for all of the financial industry. Well, I should say banking, there's also a separate regulator for insurance. And incidentally, an Israeli insurance company was hacked fairly recently, and it was a ransomware attack. They were basically pressed to pay a lot of money in ransom in order to get their customer data back. And this is something that is happening all over the world, incidentally. And then you have incentive-based regulation, which is where the government is not actually saying you must do this, but it's pressing industry to take insurance against cyber attacks, the standardization of the professionals working in cyber, and actually there are standards now being imposed about who can do what in the cyber world. There's a lot of knowledge sharing, which is something that also happens in other countries, actually all over the place. I've been involved in one of the knowledge sharing projects in the United Kingdom. I've also been working on knowledge sharing around the maritime sector, which is one of my specializations. It's highly vulnerable and presents a huge risk to the global economy. It's very important for people in shipping and ports to understand what's happening across this entire global infrastructure. Okay, how did this Israel National Cyber Organization develop? 25 years ago, when I was originally involved in the subject, the security service took responsibility for cybersecurity under what was then called information security. It was very much orientated to defense. There was little attention paid to national infrastructures. This organization was spun out. Then, when Netanyahu was prime minister the second time round, he asked Major General Itzik Ben Yisrael, who Dr. Mohammed, I'm sure knows very well. I believe they met a few days ago. And Itzik is like Mr. Cyber in Israel. He's the former head of defense research and development and one of the great geniuses of the cyber world. He was asked to establish a new framework, not the whole organization, but to understand what the national challenges were and to develop a strategy for coping with them. And what he did was he and his team, they defined, I think it was 19 different critical infrastructure sectors. And the focus of cybersecurity provided by the government or organized by the government was going to be on these infrastructure industries. This went through a couple of organizational changes. Now there is a National Cyber Directorate. It's responsible for the Prime Minister and is headed by a gentleman called Yigal Una. I'm sorry to say I cannot speak Arabic anything as well as him. I heard him in a discussion with Dr. Mohammed a few months ago. I was tremendously impressed. Anyway, what does the INCD do? Its job is to defend national cyberspace against any kind of cyber threat. It doesn't matter whether it's legal or illegal. It doesn't matter whether it comes from a terrorist organization, a 15-year-old hacker, a nation state, or whatever. It's responsible for national strategy and policy. It took over the role and incorporated the National Computer Emergency Response Team, which is something that most countries have already, but also in many countries, sector emergency response teams. And the INCD has a big organization capable of detecting cyber attacks. It's got a tremendous technology infrastructure for doing this, identifying where the attacks come from, if possible, identifying who's responsible for the attacks, how they relate to previous attacks, how they relate to known capabilities, and to respond, if possible, to block these attacks. INCD provides regulation for civilian sectors, the ones that I've already mentioned. It develops national cyber resilience, which is hugely important. Resilience is something that tends to be ignored by people talking about cyber. We're going to stop cyber attacks. They don't understand necessarily that most attacks do succeed. And as a result, you've got to prepare the target organizations, whether they're national government or banking or hospitals or whatever, to deal with what to do next, what to do after the attack has taken place. Sometimes this involves dealing with regulators, sometimes it involves dealing with the insurers, obviously restoring data backups, but it's also in many cases dealing with systems that have simply been broken, destroyed. Today we are talking about cyber attacks not only being aimed at stealing data or spying on data or stopping data being used in order to get ransom. We're also talking about the destruction of infrastructures in transportation, in healthcare, and so on and so forth, to make the entire system unavailable. And we can imagine what kind of damage can be caused, especially if we're talking about, for example, a pharmaceutical company that is suddenly unable to manufacture the vaccines for COVID-19. I'll come back to COVID-19 in a couple of minutes. INCD provides innovation leadership, which means research and development inside the organization. It provides funding and support for academic and industrial research and development, and it helps provide a better framework for the national cybersecurity ecosystem, which is something that I think is particularly strong in Israel. The ecosystem is backed up also by very large venture capital industry, both internally and internationally. So Israel actually has, if I remember well, the second largest number of cybersecurity companies active internationally after the United States. And I know a lot of these cybersecurity companies have been visiting the UAE over, well, not just the period since the signing of the Abraham Accords, but for a long time before that. And then there's obviously international cooperation, which is extremely important. We are exchanging knowledge with other countries. The UAE is one of the leading ones today, but also the United States, Britain, Singapore, Germany, and so on. And as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of international visitors to the different cyber events that take place in Israel. Okay, why is COVID relevant to this? It's not just that drug manufacturing might be stopped. It's also, by the way, to do with the data surrounding the patients, how the hospitals organize themselves, and so on and so forth. But here we're talking about something more fundamental. COVID hit Israel close to a year and a half ago. And after the initial panic, which I think was common to most countries, the government realized that it had to minimize contagion. In other words, people infecting each other. But how do we know not only who's infected? That's relatively easy, but how do we know what's the likelihood of their infecting someone else who isn't infected? It's very important. And, we can't quarantine everybody and stop them coming into contact with each other. They have to be able to go shopping. They have to get medical care, and so on and so forth. So how did we find out where they are and where they are at risk or putting other people at risk? So fortunately, we have the technology for geolocation and data mining, which could be done using people's cell phones, because the cell phone system is organized in such a way that you can actually locate every single cell phone in the country, or in fact in the world, through triangulation between the towers to a very high degree of accuracy. So we are able to say, okay, if John is in a certain location and he is infected already, and then James and Jerry are within a certain distance of him, or even in the same building, they're more likely to be infected. And so it was possible to warn the uninfected they shouldn't come into contact with John. And
I'm sorry, Mr. David. The time is tight. I'm sorry, Mr. David. The time is tight. So
okay, this is the last slide. So the security service has tremendous technical capabilities for dealing with surveillance. There was a problem of not having a legal framework to allow them to do this. So the government had to ask Parliament for temporary permission. This was a genuine regulatory problem, particularly because the director of the security service didn't really want to do this. It was outside their normal work, but also issues of civil liberties. Eventually, Parliament gave permission. It did help, in addition to all of the other things. And one of the results was that Israel came out of the COVID pandemic very quickly. It wasn't only because of vaccinations. So that's it. This is me. And I look forward to any questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Mr. David, for your valuable inputs. Very much appreciated. Our last speaker of today's discussion is Mr. Muridutpal Bhattacharya, Deputy Chief Innovation Officer of the Indian Society of Artificial Intelligence and Law and Director of the Indian Library on Artificial Intelligence and Law. Muridutpal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, ma'am. And first off, let me say this, that the whole of ICL is very honored at me being able to present here. Thank you to Trends for the opportunity. Let me share this screen. Is it visible? So, with alignment to what Mr. David said, that theoretical laws are actually not really what parties to a cyber attack would look forward to in terms of the practical world. However, I will be placing an emphasis upon customary international law and not just statutes. Well, what do we actually mean when we use the term cyber operations? Now, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Careers and Studies has actually referred to cyber operations as performance of activities which are of a counterintelligence nature. However, it is to be noted that that is not the only objective of cyber operations. Cyber operations can be malevolent as well as benevolent. Furthermore, in Thomas Aquinas had actually defined law to be the common sense of the global citizen. However, that is not the case when it comes to international law, because we are incessantly reliant upon statutes. So, what Colonel Gary Brown of the United States Air Force and Kira Poelet, Major of the United States Air Force, had said was that the first thing to know about international law is that it bears only a slight resemblance, only a passing resemblance to the kind of law which most people are familiar with. Domestic laws in most countries are passed by some sort of sovereign body after due consideration. Statutes are carefully crafted so the law has a precise effect. International law is nothing like that. Contrary to popular belief, treaties are not the primary means of establishing international law. The body of international law is a jumble of historic practice and tradition, as well as signed agreements between nations. Within this patchwork of guidance, customary international law occupies a position of prominence in developing areas of law, ahead of treaties and conventions. Now, in the absence of specific legal regimes for cyberspace, the logical approach should be to take the existing guidance towards governance of conventional warfare and consequent determination of whether the same can be applied to cyberspace. Now, the commonality of states, obviously, states all the time disagree upon practices all throughout the world, which are accepted as law in other places. As exhibited in numerous state actions, published government materials, official government statements, domestic laws, and precedents that derail actual practice. Over time, however, specific instances of state practice often develops into general custom. Like a very nice instance of the same would be the fact that certain states of the USA actually follow the Tallinn Manual 2.0, while the same is disregarded as a binding statute all through the world. The second part of the equation is tougher. For a custom to become binding, states not only need to act in a certain way, but need to act in the certain way because they think that they are legally obligated to do so. That is, the doctrine of opinio juris needs to be observed. Now, there are no mathematical formulae suggesting how many states should actually accept a practice or for how long for the practice needs to be established for it to become a binding custom. It would not be unwise to say that the more states follow a particular practice, the more likely the practice is to become a law. But however, what is the most important thing here is that the most powerful states in terms of that particular field take it upon themselves, take the initiative to make sure that the customary laws are established. Because the practice of politically powerful and active states carries more weight than of smaller nations, especially ones which are not actively engaged in the area under consideration. Now, a very good instance, and this is only an illustration, and by no means do I want to hurt any sentiments. It is well propounded that the practice by USA or the UK will have a heavier effect on the development of international naval operations rather than those of Switzerland or any other landlocked state. That is to say that exactly what I said was relevant powers in the relevant fields are the leaders in those fields in terms of starting and maintaining practices for them to develop into customary laws. Now, the length of time needed for a practice to become custom can greatly vary, as can be observed from the law of war. The customary law of war started developing millennia ago. For example, the Greeks had actually started developing the concept of jus ad bellum, just war, in the 4th century, while jus in bello, that was war during peacetime, only assumed their current forms in the 1860s during the Franco-Prussian War and the American Civil War as well. The documented atrocities in those wars actually led to the rapid developments of the modern law of war regime, starting with the first Hague Convention in 1899. Another example of customary law is that developed rather quickly is space law. In 1958, just after the year of the launch of Sputnik, which was in 1957, the UNGA, the General Assembly, created a committee to settle on the peaceful uses of outer space. By 1963, the UN had put forth the Declaration of Legal Principles governing the activities of state in the exploration of outer space, and this principle is followed till date. Now, what needs to be avoided at all costs is the inaction of states when on the receiving end of conduct harmful to it. Because I recently just stated the concept of opinio juris. So even inaction can become established practice. The official silence of the victim states can become evidence of the fact that the misconduct either did not occur or that it is not questionable in terms of international law and that does not violate any international laws. Such passiveness can cause a binding effect under the doctrine of acquiescence. I can cite a very recent example as well. Okay, let's wait for that. Let's go on with the other instances at first. So, arguably, the first cyber attack occurred in the Soviet Union in 1982, when a Trans-Siberian pipeline exploded. It was recorded by a US satellite and was referred to by one of US officials as the most monumental non-nuclear explosion and fire ever seen from space. Now, such a monumental explosion was denied by the Russian government. It is alleged that the Russian government, the KGB, the Russian Committee for State Security, was embarrassed by the fact that since it is alleged that they had actually stolen software that was developed by a Canadian company for usage in maintenance of pipelines, and the same was apprehended and predicted by the US Central Intelligence, and the US Central Intelligence had supposedly planted a bug which caused the pipeline to blow. Now, after that, there were numerous soft computer attacks against US systems such as the Moonlight Maze, Code Red, Mountain View. Then there was the Estonia Crisis, where in 2008 Russian troops invaded the Republic of Georgia during a dispute over territories in Southeast Asia. In August, prior to the intrusion, all Georgian government websites were subjected to a denial of service attack and defacement. The actions have not been attributed to the Russians, despite there being a lot of speculations. The US received a wake-up call when a worm titled Agent.btz infiltrated the US military classified records through a flash drive by a foreign agent. The purpose was to transfer US defense intelligence to foreign service. The US Cyber Command was established less than 2 years later. There were Google's allegations against Chinese hackers in 2010. Then the Stuxnet was established. The Stuxnet was a worm which primarily targeted the supervisory control and data acquisition system manufactured by Siemens. Stuxnet determined the worm was designed to affect, like, the original determination was that the worm was designed to get into Iran's Bushehr nuclear power platform or its uranium enrichment facility. However, later on, there were indeed a few malfunctions in the nuclear department, but none of them were confirmed to be caused by the Stuxnet worm. The Iranian president later stated in a news conference that the malicious software indeed had damaged the centrifuge systems, although he did not specifically state that it was Stuxnet. With regards to, another example is recently in January itself, India, in Mumbai, there was a power plant that was allegedly attacked. Now, what happened was, a certain area of Mumbai suffered a blackout for about 4 hours. And after that, what happened was a lot of media outlets covered the incident. And there were news, but later on the IT ministry did not issued an official statement stating that there was no attack. However, now the funny thing that happened was my organization decided to research this issue. What we experienced was that the day when the attack happened, a few hours after that, numerous media outlets on their websites had the incident put up. The next day, when we started to actually do a research on the same, all of those websites, when we started opening them, simply showed a 404 code error. Therefore, the all of these news bulletins were deleted. Now, this is the kind of inaction that actually becomes practice, and this is the inaction that absolutely has to stop. Now, the difference between espionage and assault. Now, what is an espionage? Espionage as globally accepted refers to the practice of using spies to gain intelligence, while attack refers to an actual assault or use of force. It is to be kept in mind that in case of an incidence of cyber attack or espionage, there is no international legal body that a state can go before and ask for the ordering of discovery or ask for collection of evidence or investigation. Neither the ICJ nor the other courts can fill this role. Any evidence collected would be classified as a secret and would probably contain politically sensitive information as well. Hence, no good would come out of letting the states investigate their own selves. Witnesses could mostly be politicians or intelligence officials, so unless a polygraph test can be administered, none of what they testify would be considered true. The issue of international intent has not been much the fabled mens rea has not been much discussed since it applies under the laws of war. Now, in case of laws of war, the intent is generally unambiguous. Thus, an interesting conundrum comes up, a very interesting conundrum indeed. Now, the conundrum is if intent indeed does not matter in cyber operations and only a few keystrokes determine whether a cyber activity will constitute espionage or assault, then any intrusion for collection purposes is potentially a threat of use of power. But if that's the case, then why has not the Security Council been extensively proactive on the issue of cyber operations?
Sorry, Mr. Ridutpal. Just a couple of more minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. All right. So there indeed a lot of cyber. There are a few laws, not a lot of laws, but not many of them are binding. Let me go to the final slide. So, if the reports from 2013 and 2015 and the resolution of the General Assembly 2018 beyond reasonable doubt established the legal provisions and practices for and against cyber operations, why have significant changes not taken place? Why have older disputes not resurfaced in courts? Why are states maintaining practices against the state established laws? As stated earlier, inaction turns into practice, which in turn evolves into custom, and that is precisely what is holding states back from adhering to the norms laid down, apart from their own benefits outweighing the global good. And these are questions to be pondered about. The only way to do away with that is for the foremost leaders in technology and cyberspace to lead the way in complying with international standards that have been set. But what is to be done if one or more field-leading states are inclined towards non-compliance simply because they benefit from illegitimate cyber operations? Such a scenario places the onus upon the UN itself to interfere and motivate the state into compliance and make sure that the compliance ensues long enough to ensure that other following states have been persuaded into complying and that the compliance has turned into an established practice or a custom. There are two broad challenges, and they are: given cyberspace's unique characteristics, interpretation of international law that is applicable to cyber operations may require a certain level of adaptation and not transformation. The subjects of international law, particularly states, may have different, if not divergent, interpretations of certain specific provisions of international law. Now, many people argue that that a consensus can be reached, as was reached in case of the UNCLOS, and that happened rather quickly. But what needs to be understood is that preceding the establishment of the UNCLOS, there was a lot of discussion and deliberation upon the same, many years of deliberations, and that has not happened for cyber laws. That has not happened for cyberspace in the international context, at least. Now, other than that, transparency framework should be established as being stored towards by the EU. Legal awareness campaigns should be done. CERT personnel and committees should be created and maintained, and every state should be encouraged to adopt cybersecurity strategies. The age-old norm of inaction or passivity needs to be done away with. It must give way to newer methods, whether offensive or defensive. And this is, I cannot lay more emphasis on this. This is the most important. Inaction must go away. Ideally, the best defense is a good offense. Proverbs should be set aside and focus should be awarded to cybersecurity and resilience. Simply put, the focus should be on inhibition and recovery rather than identification and destruction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your input. That was truly insightful. And thank you everyone for your presentations and inputs. We'll be moving to the last part of this e-symposium, which is just a general discussion. So my first question. So one major challenge in dealing with cyber threats is determining attribution, since it's very difficult to trace the origins of a malware developer or a direct cyber attacks. And since cyber crimes are committed from outside the country, my first question goes to Ms. Sama and Mr. Mridat Pal. Legally speaking, how can the concept of universal cybercrime jurisdiction be improved or expanded on to address this issue? Someone wants to elaborate. Ms. Sama?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, as been said, I'm sorry. عفوا. يعني كما قيل أن هذا التحدي هو
This challenge is one of the key challenges that we face. So it's very important that all countries agree among themselves on the criteria and the standards to be followed in order to attribute the action to an entity or a state. This will never happen unless the countries or states sit together and reach an agreement, either under the umbrella of the UN or any other international framework. But the states or the countries are the decision makers, because at the moment we are not able to answer this question, and we believe it's very important to adopt rules and standards, and this will be the job of states or countries, because they are the key player in the international agreement or conventions. Until we reach this agreement, there could be some principles to be agreed, some behaviors to be adopted, until further, or they need to respect and implement until they reach the convention, the final convention or agreement. And under the UN, there are two parallel processes. There is an international team in the UN that studied the topic, and there is advisor team, an open team that is considering the communication, telecommunication, and information in the light of international security. And the General Assembly of the UN have taken decision in this regard, and we can refer to Resolution 237 and 73 by 27. In these two resolutions, they illustrated the implementation of the international law on the cyber operations in terms of international security and peace, and they just stated that the cyberspace must be open and safe and stable and peaceful at the same time. There are steps to be taken under the umbrella of the UN to identify some principles for the countries to follow, but the key result or the key outcome is that the countries are the players to agree the standards and the agreement to attribute the action to the offender or the attacker, and to adhere to the responsibility rules in the international law. I want to say it's not easy, so the dialogue among states, the dialogue among the specialized advisors and consultants and the IT consultants is really key in achieving this target. Also, the national legislations and the intercooperation among the regional states or countries. These are things that can lead to these results, but what we say, the dialogue is key for this in this framework. Thank you very much, Dr. Sama. As you say, we have tight deadline.
Existing international law sufficient, or is a new cyber convention needed? Dr. Fahad, Mr. David, if anyone wants to elaborate.
إذا أنا ممكن أدخل
If I need to just contribute for this.
are sufficient? Definitely not. وتوجد كثير من المحاور الرئيسية.
Many themes that needs to be improved and developed in these laws and international laws that we have today in place. And I think you agree with me in some of the key points that there must be new legislations, new laws, and new behaviors that are compatible with the international law. And we have to agree, all countries need to agree on this, because without this agreement we will not reach this. And we said there are so many issues. One of them is the difficulty of attribution of such operations or attacks whenever they happen. And we are today in front of recent attacks that happened this year, and when we talk about the next years, there will be difficulties, or the difficulty in attribution will be more and more, despite the AI capabilities that we are using, the others are using the same, and these capabilities and technologies will increase the difficulty in attribution of such operations. What we say when we modify these or amend these legislations or laws, and also to integrate the private sector in order to identify the key points or the latest capabilities. Because when we say that what we have these cloud computing systems that are owned right now, they are not owned by states. They are owned by private companies, reputable companies. These companies are controlling huge amounts of data, and also issues related to digital economy. And if we don't give enough concern to securing such data and integrating these companies and establishing governance for the mechanisms for dealing and interaction with countries and adhering to the standards agreed, I think this is one of the key points that, because of its implications, not only on the development of international laws, but also for the attribution of the attackers. So I think, yes, we need to engage private companies and major private companies and identify the key points for their operations, and also continuity of cooperation with countries that are developed in the field of cybersecurity, and also the countries that are emerging in this, because we are trying to help them to benefit in their economies and protection of their systems, and help them to move toward the digital life that can help, or the digital technologies that can help them and protect their life and economy. We would say there must be preconditions, there must be criteria to enhance, to secure the infrastructure of these nations and of these companies, and sharing information amongst themselves in order to identify the attackers. Thank you, Doctor, for your valuable contribution.
I would like to agree with Dr. Muhammad, but I would like to add something to what he says. We've got to look at the analogy between cyber crime, cyber terrorism, whatever, and conventional crime when dealing with the legal implications. At the moment, we have a a genuine problem of not necessarily being able to gather reliable evidence of who is responsible for an attack. It's even relatively easy to spoof an attack in such a way that it makes you make it look as if someone else has carried out the attack. How are they going to prove that they're not responsible? It's not so straightforward. So any legal system that wants to impose sanctions or punishments on cyber attackers, for the sake of argument, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about crime or terrorism or whatever, is vulnerable to a technical ambiguity. And this means that we need to have better and more sophisticated, more powerful technology tools available. And this also, by the way, means that we need to have better artificial intelligence, but we need to be able to gather intelligence, if possible, in real time, and analyze that intelligence in the same way as the police do in cases of conventional crime. However, I have to say from my own experience, most police forces in the world, and even a lot of intelligence services in the world, do not have the level of knowledge and sophistication and even the technical tools to be able to do this. So actually, most of the breaches of international law are going to remain unpunished. Now, there are situations where it's possible to, let's say, limit the likelihood of an attack taking place through the principle of common interest. I took part in a seminar a couple of years ago at Chatham House on space security, where it was clear to us, like in the case of maritime security, that the global commons, where most of the national players have a similar interest as the same as all of the other players in maintaining security. It doesn't mean that everyone does. It doesn't mean that in the case of maritime law, we can rely on everyone being motivated by altruism. No, it's not the case. Nevertheless, to the extent that we can rely on common interest, it helps us. We need, in any case, to develop much better tools. I'd also say something else about Midland Paul's comments about UNCLOS. Because I've been involved in maritime quite a lot over the last few years, I've seen that it's effective most of the time, but it's based on a centuries-old tradition of maritime law, of admiralty law, which has been going on for many centuries. And it's not something that just happened out of the blue. If we're expecting some sort of revolution in international cyber law to take place, no, it isn't going to happen. And not just because there are a lot of states that don't want it to happen, but because people are not ready. There's no consensus of how it should work. And I think that this whole discussion, which is very important in its own right, we've got to be a little bit careful about the limitations of what we can achieve and what we can seek to achieve. We've got to look at defenses and resilience as being the key to this, much more than law, because law is not going to provide the protection that everybody needs. And I'm sorry to say this, but this is my own experience. And by the way, also my experience in the context of money laundering and terror finance, in which I've been heavily involved for many years. The legal system does not provide strong defenses, particularly now that we've got virtual currencies. So let's be a little bit realistic about what we can seek to achieve here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. David. Mr. Mridat Pal, would you like to elaborate as well?
Yes, I would. I am in complete concurrence with what Mr. David said. But this is more of a question, and this is more of a question I would like to ask as to, would it not be wise for the UN to ask the most politically active, the most politically powerful states of the world to actually establish certain laws in their own nations, not in concurrence with whatever the UN says to be the statute, but for them to establish? Because let me say it like this: if today United States of America decides to follow a central law on cyber warfare or cyber operations, I am almost certain that there will be a lot of states, such as India itself, that will follow what USA is following, and that will cause a certain amount of customary law to be established all throughout the world. Like at the same time, while deliberations upon international treaty, an international instrument is conducted at the UN. Like, would it be possible? Would it be wise to say that this can happen?
If I can respond to this, in principle, yes. And don't forget that most of the more sophisticated countries of the world have laws dealing with cybercrime and so on and so forth. Israel has had a computer law since the 90s, if I remember well, shortly after I was involved in the Israeli government. The United States has all sorts of laws, Britain has all sorts of laws, and so on and so forth. There are also EU regulations, which essentially take the force of law. The problem is not the existence of law, and it's not the problem of general consensus that there should be law. The problem is the enforcement of these laws. And there are always going to be those who want to break the laws, including nation states. We can say to ourselves, the United States is going to lead this and therefore everyone's going to follow. No, China will not follow if it doesn't see this as being in its national interest. You as an Indian know enough about the threat coming from China, and of course Taiwan knows about threats coming from, and so on and so forth. There is a tremendous amount of a gap, let's call it, between the decision to impose law as a principle and the ability to enforce the law, punish wrongdoers. Who's going to punish China? For that matter, who's going to punish several African and South American countries from which there's a great deal of cyber attack? It's not going to happen. Who's going to punish Daesh? The only thing you can do with Daesh is to kill people. I'm sorry to be very blunt about it, or imprison them. But there are things that the legal framework doesn't actually make happen. And I'm sorry that I'm saying this also to a representative of the Red Cross. I've said this in the context of discussions in the United Nations. We would like to make certain things happen. It doesn't mean that we can do it. I'm sorry to be very blunt.
Thank you, David. And with that, on behalf of Trends Research and Advisory, I thank all the panelists for their contribution and the viewers who have joined us today to participate. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again.